Hello, in this video I want to talk about return values inside of functions. In the lab that we just did, we printed out some data inside of the function. And while that works, another way we could have done this, and perhaps a much better way, would be to go through and return a value. So the concept is you go through and you get your answer and then you return it from the function. And this means that when the function runs, in this case the function is called add values, when that function runs, it's going to evaluate into the answer. In this case, if I pass in 10 and 5, it's going to evaluate into 15. You could think of it as this starts to run, it evaluates into 15, which gets converted to a string, which then gets concatenated together, and then it gets printed out. Now, what's better about this is that you have now separated the processing code from the presentation code. We talked about that as being a good way to organize your work. So return values are a recommended practice. Let me copy this chunk of code and we'll play with it for just a minute. I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to add a new Python file. I'll call it test. And I'll paste that code in there. And we'll see how it runs. Gives me the value 15, life is good. Now, return also steps out of the code inside of your function. Let me do this. Print got here. And you can see I never actually print out the message got here. That's because I don't get there. As soon as it hits the word return, it returns the value but doesn't run any more code. And for that reason, you can't have two returns. The second one will never be reached. So return needs to be at the end of your function where it returns your data. And that when you use return, it's going to change the way the function runs, and that it evaluates into a particular value, if you would, an object, generically speaking. It's going to evaluate into that, and so now your function does more than just process some code. It actually evaluates as an expression. Now, in some languages, when a function returns a value and can evaluate as an expression, it will be given one name. When it doesn't return a value, it just does basic processing, it will be given another name. So, for example, in Visual Basic, in visualbasic.net, if a function returns a value, it's called a function. If it doesn't return a value, it's called a sub-procedure or subroutine. So you may hear sub-procedure, subroutine, stored procedure. There's a lot of different names for this thing. But it all comes out to basically a function, and some functions return data and some do not. Sometimes you can return multiple values, not by using multiple return statements, but just by going through and using a comma separated list. Python allows you to do this. You can see though that Python has made a tuple. The parentheses here are a giveaway. Remember that Python does that concept of tuple packing. So if you don't use parentheses, it's going to pack it up as a tuple anyway. So it didn't really make much difference there. The nice thing about that is I can then later on refer to the code as picking up a value by unpacking the tuple as well. Let me just take this code here. You know what? I'll just go ahead and use mine. So when I call the function, add values, it's returning a tuple. But I could also go through and just collect some values. Let's say return value 1 and return value 2. And we'll see what happens. So on line, interesting, line 9 actually prints out the word function add values at a particular memory location. That's because I forgot to give it some values. Let's give, how about 1 and 1, just for fun. So you can see it added 1 and 1 together, it gave me 2 and test, and it prints it as a tuple. If on the other hand on line 9 I unpack the tuple, I can then later on print them out individually, like on line 10. And of course this is going through and just evaluating into a tuple of results. Tuples are one way of doing it. I think you'll find that list provides you a little bit more flexibility. And all you have to do to return a list is just to put square brackets around it. You can see now it's coming back as a list, but it works the same way as before. I've been able to extract it or unpack that list. In my code here, I've declared a variable called decimal answer. In this example here, I've made a list called list results. I've bundled up the results of that and then returned that. I used 2 lines there, or I could have used 1, but I think it's a little bit more explicit as far as what I'm trying to accomplish. Later on in this code here, if I want to print out the results, I can just say element 1 or element 2, and element 0 was the answer. There is an impact on whether you use a list or a tuple, and we're going to see that a little later. But the next thing we're going to do is we're going to try working with a list of results in Lab 2, and I'll see you there.